Okay, it's gonna be May. I am streaming to YouTube for the first time, so I'm hoping that everything is set up okay. Ran some tests yesterday, definitely wanting to start on time because that's one of the sticking points that I have, but there is that slight delay. If there's any issues, you guys can't hear me, something seems off. Nick, I know that you're tuning in. I appreciate it. Text me if something's up, all right? But let's get this webinar started. So today's webinar, thank you for tuning in on your day off here on Memorial Day, last day of May, Monday, May 31st. Can we talk Asian hate? Very, very loaded, very, very heavy, very, very serious. I think there's maybe a little bit of confusion as to what to expect. And that's okay. We're going to do this together because, as I'll point out right here, with just starting on who am I? Like, why do I think I can talk about Asian hate? So my name is John Dow. I call myself a conversation coach. That's just a more gimmicky term for a speech coach. For those who don't know me, I am a professional Asian. I am not a professor. I'm not a doctor. I'm not part of any kind of executive board, but I really, really don't like webinars. And in the general context, I think most people don't either. Most people are going to equate them to meetings, right? And I've been to a couple, and I feel like with everything that's going on, this is a little bit more serious. Like we can't just have, oh, that meeting should have been an email energy with all the AAPI stuff that's going on. And with what I do as a speech coach, enhancing, improving communication, streamlining things so people aren't overthinking. We want quality conversation. And one of the big pushes that I want to do today is to show people that they can do that, even if they aren't professors or doctors, even if they're not part of a nonprofit, even if they're not the most up to date with everything that's going on. I had a conversation with a family member recently. And, we were talking about the stuff that was going on in New York, stuff that's been going on in California. And he said that, I don't feel like I've been following the news close enough to have an opinion either way. And that really stuck with me because he's not the first person who's mentioned that. On one hand, I get it, but it really bothered me that we're kind of gatekeeping ourselves from this conversation by thinking that we have to know X amount of information before we can even speak about it. I feel like with a lot of other topics, sports, TV, pop culture things, we don't hold ourselves back from just sharing an opinion, right? And on the flip side, the people who are there at the forefront, the professionals, the doctors, the people with the PhDs, they're falling into a lot of trappings that are holding them back from furthering the conversation as well. This family member, they referenced Eugene's video from the Try Guys. We need to talk about anti-Asian hate. I don't remember if it's 1 hour or 2 hours long. And this video, if you haven't seen it, it's well worth checking out. This is kind of a gold standard that we have right now. But again, to reiterate, you don't have to be at the very top to be able to join the discussion. Why would you pigeonhole yourself? Why would you put that extra pressure that you got to be to Eugene's level to just talk about it? And I'll admit myself, as I've been prepping for this webinar, I get nerves. I've been thinking all the stuff that I can include. You can't be comprehensive when you're joining your community, when you're just talking with your friends and family. You don't need to be at this level, okay? So what I'm really hoping to do with this webinar today is I want to raise the bar, quality communication. Let's not fall into cliches. Let's try to avoid some of the tropes. Let's open the floodgates. Let's make sure that we have a communication across all levels. So it's not just a bunch of academics preaching to the choir, just trying to flex how smart they are. Let's make sure that people are just not staying within their comfort zone. And in order to do that, I want to point out how we can avoid some of the pitfalls that happen in webinars and also just in discussion circles themselves. So again, this topic's really, really heavy. And I don't want to make light of it, but maybe this metaphor could help a lot of people who are trying to follow along. It's funny for me that we all have a certain standard when it comes to eating out, right? And we can all recognize bad food service, and we all have a very low tolerance for it. But when it comes to webinars or anything that's more corporate or academic or quote unquote professional, we're more quiet about it. Or we might recognize it, but we don't really call it out. And it's strange because a lot of webinar problems, they're just like bad food service. So what am I talking about here? I'll try to lay it out and then we'll explore some of these points a little bit more in detail as we go. So seating, right? When you arrive at the restaurant, if you made an appointment, you made a reservation, you expect it to be settled, right? Why isn't my table ready? That's a big gripe. It's a big annoyance when you go into a restaurant. I hate it when webinars, they don't start on time. You know, that's why I've really tried my best, even with this new YouTube setup, to get things rolling and going, because there are people who are waiting. There are people in the audience who showed up. You know, you might be waiting for more people to trickle in, but it's a disrespect for the people who are there, ready and eager to listen to what you have to share and provide. The next thing that's very strange is when you go to a restaurant, you know, you might have done a little bit of research. Maybe you were on Yelp. Maybe it was a referral by someone else. They said, oh, you got to go to this place. They have the best seafood, lobster, whatever. Once you're there, you don't need to be sold on the accolades of the restaurant, right? Like once you're already through the door and through the your foot is in the door, you're waiting to be seated. They shouldn't have to be selling you on the reputation of the place. They might be selling you on entrees, but not the reputation of the place. So to me, it's really strange that when a webinar starts and they have all their guests, they focus on the resume when they introduce these people. Okay, this person is a professor of this. They've been teaching blah, blah, blah. They have all these type of awards. There's potential to improve that. I'll point that out here in the next couple of slides. Continuing on with this bad food service metaphor, once you've ordered and you're being served your food, it's going to bother you if the proportions aren't right. Like appetizers too tiny, appetizers too big. You get your main entree and there's no meat there, right? Like where's the good stuff? And this lends itself tying into webinars when the pacing and the introduction and the body and the conclusion are out of whack. One of the problems with a lot of webinars is they are front heavy. So the introduction, sometimes that's 2/3 of the webinar. That's not good because, again, depending on the purpose of the webinar, if it's just to educate, okay. But if you're trying to further discussion and 2/3 of it are caught in the introduction, the pretext, you're cutting away time from allowing people to talk and actually share their experiences. Now, going into checking. So you're there, you're trying to enjoy your food, and the server comes by. How is everything? How is everything? How is everything? I don't want to crap on servers. A lot of them are probably forced to check in that way, but we know that that's not real communication, right? So in a similar way, when we're having our discussion circles and we're going through certain motions and we're saying certain things, on the surface, I guess that's communication, but that's not real quality communication. And I'll point out later how we can better that. And finally here, you know, everything's all said and done. You're finished eating at the restaurant. Will that be all? You get your bill, right? And then after you had your bill, after you leave, is there anything worth mentioning? Are you going to be going back to that place? Are you going to be telling other people about this place? A lot of times, I think because they're so information dense and because there is this pressure to maybe be more academic, to be quote unquote professional, a lot of these webinars are run kind of like checklists, right? Do this task, mention this, mention that, and they do it. They put a lot of effort and hard work towards that. But when everything's all said and done, what are we going to do from that? Is that it? You know, is that actually going to be something that sticks with us? Is that something that we're going to continue to discuss? If there's no bigger takeaway, that's a problem. So at the start, besides starting on time, some things that I think could fix and improve the webinar's overview is one, addressing the purpose. With a lot of these issues, raising awareness, right? We got to raise awareness. We got to let people know. That's an okay first step. But if we want to make it better, raising awareness of what specifically? And after we are more aware, after we're better informed, what are we going to do? So the idea that Asian hate crimes are happening. Okay, they're happening. They seem to be concentrated in New York and California. Okay, now that we have that information, what are we going to do about it? What should we do about it? Is it a call for support? Hey, our extended family, they need a lot of checking in California and New York. Okay. Do we need to be on the lookout? We need to be more cautious and aware. There's not mixed messaging, but raising awareness in itself, that's not really actionable. And I think we could do better on that point. The next thing, as I mentioned before, with the bad food service comparison, with your guests that you have on board, don't focus too much on their accolades. I think it would be a lot better if the host or the people in charge talked about why they picked these guests specifically. So here's an example. Today I'm riding solo, right? But if I had guests, if I ever did a future AAPI webinar, I'd probably pick Rex Dizzy, Hiroko Tabuchi, and Fat Rabbit Farm. So why would I pick these people? I could tell you if I did the standard introduction. Well, Rex Dizzy is a rapper in New York. Hiroko Tabuchi, she's a reporter for the New York Times. Fat Rabbit Farm is a duo that consists of Jason and Patty, and they're out in LA. Does that give you like a sense of who these people are? It's okay. But I would want to know about Rex Dizzy because him being a rapper, him being a musician, he's around a very different group of people than we are, right? He has a very different lifestyle than what we have. And I'd be really curious if his day has changed at all, or if maybe it's basically the same. So we either get comfort or just a very unique take on everything that's going on. Hiroko Tabuchi, unfortunately, she's been a victim of crime. At this point, we can't really say for sure if it's racially motivated, but she was spat on, right? And she was tweeting about the experience. And one of the big takeaways for me was just how she has to approach going on walks. That's something that she liked to do in New York, but now she's not going to have her headphones in anymore. She can't be listening to music. She can't just be listening to podcasts, being in her own little world. She has to be more mindful and watch her surroundings. Then for Fat Rabbit Farm, their business was impacted by COVID severely very early on, but I think they've been managing okay ever since. And so when you have this business, you have a very unorthodox business to begin with, and your sights are set on that and the stress that comes with that, and now you have to worry about all this other stuff that's going on as well. What is their day-to-day life like? I think their insight would be greatly appreciated. So that's just a sample of the different tone, the different qualifiers of who you're bringing on to speak. And that also preps the audience. Maybe they're going to ask better questions when they see these people in that lens that you do. All right. Another option here at the very beginning, a lot of people, they want to do a moment of silence. The Asian Americans who've passed away because of the crimes that have been going on. I think a moment of silence, very respectful, it's great. But if you've started your webinar late and it takes you a while to get going and you're just starting to get your momentum and your pacing right, and then you put it at a screeching halt to do a moment of silence, maybe there's an option to move the moment of silence to the very end of your webinar. Just an option. Sandwiches. Okay. So what makes a good sandwich, right? For a lot of people, it's not just the bread, it's not just the filling, it's the proportion of the bread and the filling all coming in together. If you have too much bread, you're going to be disappointed, right? And this goes back to the idea that You have your introduction, your conclusion. These are your bread pieces, the body, the meat, the filling. That's the really, really good stuff. And if you take too long to get to that point, you're doing yourself a disservice. And why does that happen? Again, how much pretext do you want to include? And the pretexting is kind of like the biggest problem or the biggest struggles that the introduction section has. And I'll give you an example. So if you're going to try to show history, if you're trying to establish precedent that hate crimes have been going on for a lot longer than you might have expected, Vincent Chin, unfortunately, is a quote unquote good example of that. This is a little bit more recent, but I've seen webinars where they try to trace things back to the 1800s, early 1900s. And again, depending on the purpose of your webinar, it might be helpful to include that information. But, even beyond Vincent Chin, we have stuff that's been happening in the past year. So how far back do you want to go? And I think maybe Vincent Chin is a good starting point. He is somebody that, even if he's repeated again and again in future webinars, I don't think that's such a problem because he is not a mainstream name. I wasn't even aware of Vincent Chin until probably like the last 5 years. And again, to qualify things, I can present you this slide and you see all this information, but what really hit me was this guy was only 27 years old when he passed away. I'm older than that. That blows my mind too. He passed away 8 days before his wedding. Got into a fight. The situation in Detroit was that a lot of auto manufacturer workers were losing their jobs because of competition from Japan. And these guys assumed him to be Japanese. It's because you little mother effers that were out of work. And the huge injustice here is they weren't given any jail time, only 3 years probation, fined $3,000 in order to pay just $780 in court costs. And the judge, he said that these weren't the kind of men you send to jail. So again, we need to qualify it further. You didn't know before. Now you know. What are we going to do with this information though? Okay, we established precedent. Now what? We need to do better about how we're going to link these things. So again, this isn't rhetorical. How do we use this information? So we learned it. Okay, we're going to share it to other people. I don't think these are our only two options, right? But me, myself, I kind of struggle. What exactly are we supposed to be doing with it? And this is what we should be questioning each other and thinking things through, because I can't believe that these can't be our only options, right? All right, back to that metaphor of the server just checking in. The idea is that this isn't real conversation. This isn't real communication, right? A lot of what's happening around AAPI matters. It's what I would call first step communication. So you have hashtags, stop AAPI hate, Asians are human, represent Asian. You have slogans, I am not a virus, this is my home too. Hate is the real virus, okay? We have people who are mentioning resources. So good two resources right here is the Asian American Journalists Association, AAJA or AAJC, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And it's good that this is out there. It's good that we have hashtags trending and people can join in on the conversation. It's good that we have certain mantras. You feel empowered maybe when you don't have the vocabulary to contribute something further. But again, this is just the first step. And when this stuff, it's easy for it to trend, that's still not real dialogue. And we need to be having more real dialogue. So the crux of the matter is, how do we get closer to the real talk then? So one thing, go ahead and be open and honest. Be open on what you don't know. So you're not a professional. You haven't been keeping up with the news. What is it exactly that you feel like you need to learn more about? And being able to talk about that, that's a discussion in itself. The next thing, maybe don't yield to your insecurities so much. Speak more about the quote unquote minor struggles. You don't have to preface your problems like, okay, well, nobody actually beat me up, but someone yelled at me and it had me scared. You can talk about that. Like, just because something's not at the extreme doesn't mean you can't voice your opinion or voice your experiences. Don't gatekeep yourself. Don't lock yourself out of the conversation because of that. You can speak like a human. It's not always logical. It doesn't always make sense. It's not always justified. That's just part of being a person, though. And if you force everything to make sense, to be real neat and tidy, then it just goes back to this first step communication stuff, right? And you don't need to be doing that. Uh-oh, my slides. Here we go. So the last point here is slow down on quote unquote solutions. And I want to clarify because I put this in quotes. I hope that the people up top, the people who are in charge, the people who are in power, the people who are way smarter than me, they can find solutions and they can find real solutions quick. I hope so. But for the rest of us, when we don't have that knowledge, we got to watch out for toxic positivity. And I would like for that to stop. Like, oh, you shouldn't be afraid to live your life, be strong. That's not a real solution, right? Hey, well, if you're feeling so scared, like maybe you should just start carrying around mace. That option for people who go out and buy mace if they feel more comforted, that's great, but that's not really a solution, right? I think a lot of people, when they speak that way, it sounds dismissive, right? But if we push that a little bit further, why are they being so dismissive? Why is it hard for people to accept that some of these things are happening, right? And if we can prod them and push them a little bit to speak about their discomfort, why they don't want to believe certain things, that in itself is a discussion. I don't know if we can call it a good discussion because it's probably not going to be pleasant. It's probably going to be really ugly. It's probably going to meander around, but we need to be having a lot of that conversation too. Finally here, the pacing of a lot of webinars. So you set your pretext, you set your discussion points, you hear from the panel, you might wind things down and open the floor to questions from the audience. So to make this process smoother, I think it helps if you pregame. You don't have to wait until the day of the webinar to get questions, right? If leading up to the webinar, you're putting out polls or like you've been joining other discussions with people, you can pull from that experience and gather those questions. And also, you can integrate the questions throughout your webinar. You don't have to wait until the very end until you say, okay, now it's time for questions. It's probably helpful if you do have a Q&A at the end, but you don't have to just wait for the Q&A, right? And finally, utilize everybody who's involved. So it's great that you're opening the floor, but you don't have to wait for the webinar audience themselves. I've seen webinars where the host, he said, oh, I had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask the guests, but he sidestepped himself to give room to the audience. And that's great. But if the audience takes time to warm up or people are thinking, it feels a little awkward, right? It shouldn't be. The silence shouldn't be awkward, but you're waiting. That time could be better utilized. And if you have stuff that's ready to go, something that you really want to speak about, the panelists, they might have questions for each other. Ride that momentum. Utilize that energy. So, winding things down here, the key theme is let's do better. Whatever personal grievances I have against webinars, I don't want to be too spiteful on that because the people who are doing it, they're trying. It's just compared to other movements like Black Lives Matter, I feel like the Asian movement right now is in the very early stages. We're kind of in that first draft movement. And that makes sense. We're not as established. We're probably not as prevalent. We're not as vocal. That's something that I didn't address earlier, how, aside from the model minority myth, a lot of Asians just aren't putting their voices out there. For every person that you do see tweeting or protesting, there's a bigger chunk of Asian people who are not there, not saying anything. It's really hard to get a sense of how prevalent all these things are going on. Like if you've seen the news cycle, it definitely seems like a huge rise, but how much of that is the full picture there? I was showing my mom a map of Asian languages being spoken in the US, and she was kind of surprised. But the thing that we had to remember as well is like there's so many Asian people who aren't taking the census. So we're just always underrepresented in that way. But winding things down. So I hope I've made it clear that you don't have to be a quote unquote professional to contribute to the conversation. Um, let's make sure that we don't repeat the exact same talk from a year from now. Again, certain things like Vincent Chin, okay, yeah, mention him again. But we need to be beyond those first step communication points, okay? And one of the things that you could do is just start by doing better than me. Um, it's funny, I did a rehearsal yesterday, and in some ways, I think yesterday's rehearsal was a lot smoother than the talk that I'm giving today. But I could always be better, could always review. If you're tuning in and you feel like you could do a better job than me, I don't think that's the worst thing. And that's kind of what it is all about. So now that this is out here in the ether, if I have to talk about it again, if I want to support people, like if any single thing doesn't have to be it in its entirety. Um, People who do other webinars, I hope you tried to dial back on some of these webinar sins. But people who never do webinars, who never want to do a webinar, um, you don't have to do a webinar. Just bring some of these ideas to the dinner table or when you're having a beer or maybe something that you've always been wondering to ask your Asian friends or something like that. All right. So if you want to get in contact with me, find me on Twitter, COMMDAO, ComDAO, or you can reach me by email, let's talk at comdao.com. Again, I appreciate your time. Thanks for tuning in, and let's keep at this discussion, all right?